Hi guys, Professor O'Brien here with another quick lecture on the material for the final week of the semester. And in this case, it's chapter 12 of Rhetorical Grammar, Words and Word Classes. We're not going to be spending a great deal of time on this because it's material that we've covered fairly extensively using McGraw-Hill. I was testing you at the start of the semester, again at the midterm, and I'll probably be testing you again at the end of the semester on things like nouns and verbs, adjectives. Can you identify them? Now, it opens with a discussion of your lexicon. And the point really here of this section on pages 212 to 215 is that your brain has an amazing ability to encode information without you really knowing it. So the text provides some examples of erroneous sentences which you, as native speakers, will know immediately are erroneous. Paul sometimes had a trouble with his homeworks. Rob was always being tall. Kate walked to home. Now, all three of these are wrong, and you as native speakers will know immediately that they're wrong. But you might be unable to explain why. Why can't you have a trouble? Why can't you have homeworks? Well, essentially, you're not just storing words in your mind, you're storing words with rules in your mind. When you're storing nouns, some of them can be pluralized and others can't. Homework cannot be pluralized. You might never have consciously realized that, but unconsciously you know it's a word that you can't put in the plural. Trouble, you can't count. You can say John had his troubles, but you can't say a trouble. There isn't a single trouble. Now, this might be difficult for students coming from a second language background. They haven't encoded the information in the same way. And that's kind of what chapter 12 is about, introducing students who might be a little less familiar with sophisticated rules like this. That said, I don't intend to spend a great deal of time on this chapter. I think we've covered this pretty well over the course of the semester, and I'm more interested in getting this out of the way. Okay. There are levels of encoding as well. I've heard even professors of English say things like, there have been less bicycle accidents in the country this year. Now, that in an ordinary conversation, that's probably going to go unnoticed. But bicycle accidents are countable. So you don't use less with that, you use fewer. There have been fewer bicycle accidents. On the other hand, you can't really count sugar, can you? So could you say, I saw fewer sugar on the kitchen floor? Probably not, but you certainly can say, I saw less sugar on the kitchen floor. Whatever happened there. Makes more sense. There's the easy stuff to remember, and there's a slightly more sophisticated upper level stylistic material to remember, like fewer and less. In the second case, I would simply tell you to be vigilant. Be more aware of the language you're using and be more aware of the language that you're hearing around you. Okay, now, we've been through the parts of speech, so I'm not inclined to spend much time on this section here on page 215, except to draw your attention to the distinction the text makes between form classes and structure classes. Form classes are basically words that have lexical value in and of themselves. When I say dog to you, you get a picture of something. But when I say for to you, you probably don't think of anything. There's no image connected with for. Now, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs all fall into the form classes. These are the words that have lexical value, words that you can typically associate a picture or a concept with. On the other hand, structure classes are there really to change the meaning of the words around them. If I say cat, you see a picture. If I say the, you see no picture. Now, if I say the cat, you can readily understand that the is doing something to the word cat. In this case, it is a determiner. It's telling us we're talking about a particular cat, not any cat. But the on its own does not work. It can only function in conjunction with other words. Cat, on the other hand, stands alone. It's fine. Okay, so that's the major point about parts of speech. The form classes. I do not intend to spend much time on this because you know what nouns are. Some of you may have forgotten the trickier sides of nouns. For instance, let's see. Trying to think of an example here now. You can use a verb, I lack pencils. But you can turn that into a noun as well, can't you? The lack of pencils. And in that case, the word lack isn't a verb anymore, it's a noun. So you do get tricky members of the noun family. But I'm inclined to say 95% of nouns will probably fall into position X, where the following sentence contains X. X is good. You can throw almost anything in there. Cats are good. Study is good. Beauty is good. And now you readily understand it's not what the thing is, might stand for an action, it's how it grammatically behaves in the sentence that makes it a noun. There are some unusual nouns like plural only forms, scissors, for example. And then there are collective nouns like team or jury. And then, of course, there are proper nouns. Professor O'Brien, New York, Australia. We've discussed verbs extensively. I'm on to page 219 here. I don't propose to spend much more time talking about them. Be aware that there's a difference between auxiliary verbs, which act to help the main verb. So John has drunk the milk. You'll readily see that drunk is the main verb there. Has is just providing more information. It's an auxiliary verb. And it has no intrinsic meaning except to change the tense. Aside from that, remember the distinction between transitive and intransitive verbs. John kicks the cat, but you can't really say John kicks. You have to add a noun phrase after kick, really. And what about the following? John sleeps. You cannot add a noun phrase directly after sleeps. It makes no sense. John sleeps the cat. Essentially, if you can put a noun phrase right after the verb, it's transitive. If you can't, it's not. Anything else about verbs? It's been covered earlier in the course. Go looking for it. There's a fairly extensive introduction to the various kinds of verbs in chapters 1 and 3 of rhetorical grammar. Adjectives, not much to say about them really. They modify nouns and they typically have comparative and superlative forms. Green, greener, greenest. There isn't much to say about them. Adverbs. I am inclined to remind you of how important adverbs are, because they're the only class, the only category of word that can move. That is to say, you can choose to put an adverb at the start of a sentence, in the middle of a sentence, at the end of a sentence. Otherwise, adverbs typically derive from adjectives, but don't modify nouns, but verbs. There's not much else I can say about that. Page 221 is a very important section about derivational affixes. The point is that we can, by developing an awareness of derivational affixes, we can double and triple our vocabulary. If you turn to the exercise at the top of page 222, exercise 39, you will see that you can make verbs, adjectives, adverbs of the noun grief. How could you make a verb of grief? You can say grieve, right? John is grieving his dead father. How could you make an adjective of grief? Grievous, right? The crime was grievous in the extreme. How could you make an adverb of grief? Grievously. The bandits behaved grievously during their raid, or John was grievously injured. So, learning how to make new words from others by affixing derivational morphemes is a great skill, and I strongly recommend practicing. As I say, it will double, maybe even triple your vocabulary, and will show you how flexible the English language is. Not just English, of course. Many languages depend on derivational affixes to make new words. Okay, now the structure classes. We saw determiners in chapter 1. Determiners were traditionally defined as simply the or a, the car, a car. But now we recognize that possessives are a sort of determiner. John's car, the astronaut's car, the angry professor's car. Any possessive behaves very much like a determiner. And a determiner essentially determines how specific the noun is that follows. So if I run into a room and shout, "The house is on fire," it's pretty clear that "the" is specifying a house that everybody is familiar with. It's either the house we're all in, or it's a house that we all know. So yes, in the same way, I could run into the room and say, "Johnny's house is on fire," and that specifies it to one single person's house. But you can understand, I hope, that these are determining the number of the houses, or of the noun rather, or who owns it, or what the relationship of that house is to you or me. Okay. Auxiliaries. I don't think this is the place to go into auxiliaries. We have seen auxiliaries in the past. In chapter 3, we saw the 12 tenses of the English language, of the English verb, all being made with auxiliaries. I eat, I am eating, I ate, I was eating, I have been eating, etc. You get the idea. These English forms its tenses using auxiliaries. Modals, often quite complicated, particularly for people coming from languages which don't have modals. Spanish would be one of those languages, although it does have some slightly modal verbs like deber and poder, but typically not really. The English modals can, could, may, might, shall, should, etc. They deserve a section of their own. I would say look up modals if you're interested in them, particularly if you're coming from an ESL background, and learn how to use them. I feel that mastery of modals makes one of the major differences between native speakers and non-natives. Qualifiers. We have seen these before. We haven't really had a word for them. They're the words that modify adjectives or adverbs. He's a happy man. He's a very happy man. Very is basically qualifying the adverb, the adjective, isn't it? The air was somewhat cold that morning. The climber very cautiously set her route. Nothing more to say about qualifiers there. Page 225, prepositions. Overlooked because they're typically easy. But they are also the glue of language, and they are specific to the situations they're used in. So if you look up in a dictionary the entries for or of, you'll find that they may have up to 12 or 20 separate uses depending on the situation they're being used in. So on, for example, John lives on Fifth Avenue. Does that mean he actually has a house in the middle of the road? No, it means somewhere near Fifth Avenue, probably with a door overlooking the avenue. John lives there. But John is standing on the diving board. Now he actually is on the diving board. So you can see prepositions can be tricky. You often have to learn their use through practice. Another thing about prepositions, poof, whatever it was I was going to say, it's gone. Particles, page 226, they look exactly like prepositions, but the difference is when they are placed in conjunction with another verb, that verb develops a new meaning. So, how about the following? John stands. There's John standing on the corner. John stands Mary up. Ah, now that means something very different, you'll agree. It means that John arranged to meet Mary and never arrived. How would you know that from the combination of stand and up? You wouldn't. You simply have to learn the meaning of that combination by heart. More crucially, the up at the end looks like a preposition. It's not. In this case, it is a particle used in conjunction with the verb stand to give the verb a new meaning. Hopefully you understand that. Conjunctions, we've spoken a lot about conjunctions because we've spoken about how important it is to put that glue between sentences. And indeed, clauses. You can have a subordinating conjunction like when. John will return when he has finished his work. Hopefully you'll agree with me that the main phrase, the main clause in that sentence is John will return. And the subclause is when he has done his work, or whatever it was I said. It adds more information about the conditions of John returning. There's a long section here on pronouns, and I'm not inclined to spend a great deal of time on them. Pronouns they straddle the area between words that have their own sense and structured class words. They can't exist alone. Every pronoun, by definition, has to have an antecedent. Professor O'Brien walked into the room. He was angry. The antecedent of he there is Professor O'Brien. There are several classes of pronouns, and it is worth paying attention to the subclasses between pages 232 and 235, but they're not terribly difficult to understand. What's the difference between me and myself? I glanced at me in the mirror. Can you say that? Sort of. But seeing as it's you can see in the mirror, it makes more sense to use a reflexive pronoun. I saw myself in the mirror. We can use those reflexive pronouns as intensives as well. John likes to listen to rock music. I myself prefer classical music. You can see the myself there isn't being used reflexively. It's simply pointing out that it's me as opposed to him who likes classical music. Reciprocal pronouns, as often as not, it's a quantity of two, but you sometimes get more. David and Anne help each other. And you could make it three. David, Anne, and Mary help each other. But typically each is used for two, whereas one another refers to three or more. I bet you didn't know that. So David, Anne, and Mary help one another. Because it's three. Okay. Demonstrative pronouns, they're basically exactly like demonstrative determiners, except they stand for everything. These will be perfect for the costumes. And you can see whatever these are, they were mentioned in the previous sentence. This also needs an antecedent, but the object is being presented, or the group of things is being presented. Indefinite pronouns can be a bit tricky, but they just require a bit of practice. Remember, most of them are single. Also, there's the added danger of inadvertently sounding sexist when you use these. Everyone should bring his own lunch. Ouch. That suggests everyone in the group is male. However, the only way to get around that is to say everyone should bring his or her lunch. Or to commit the previously dreadful sin of using they for a single. Everyone should bring their lunch. Honestly, they and their has become so common, referring to single quantities, that I'm inclined to let that one go. Some grammar books, particularly the old-fashioned ones, will argue that you have to use a plural quantity with they. Maybe. So that's chapter 12, covered more or less. I hope you found some use out of it, and I wish you a great day. Thank you.